From Michelle and Jen about the importance of how you ask questions and the use of qualitative data, as well as sort of the more numerical yes or no. We often use mixed methods in our surveys, and we find it to be really valuable in understanding why they may answer a question by reading the qualitative data. I think like so many communities, we all were worried about the impact of COVID-19, the pandemic, on care, trials, access to approved therapies. We set out to do this survey very early on in the pandemic. It was actually in April when we launched it. And the purpose of it was really to gain insight and develop tools and resources for the community over time. This was on a rolling basis. The survey was never meant to be a publication. It was meant to guide us and to hear directly from the patient community as to how the pandemic is impacting them and their lives as it pertains to care, trials, and approved therapies. So I'm going to review some of the data. We just launched a second survey, and you're going to get the first look at the data from that second survey. We're still analyzing it. But the first survey we launched, as I said, in April, and we collected data through June. So it was a small time period, but it's important to recognize the time in which patients were, answering questions as it pertains to the pandemic and where we were as a country and a patient community. Majority of the respondents were caregivers. And we have produced a report from the results of this study. We had representation across a number of the states, a large portion of the states, and a number of clinics, so good responses there. And the age breakdown of the respondents, you can see in your screen, 50% came from those with children ages 7 to 16. So you can go to the next slides there. So, patients typically have a visit to their neuromuscular center for a care visit twice a year as standard of care. And we were, of course, very interested to know, how this was being impacted by the pandemic and the shutdown and what was going to happen to care. From the results, you can see we were pleased to see that many had not had their care visit canceled or rescheduled by themselves or by the clinic. Again, this was early in the pandemic. Some may not have had a care visit coming up in this time period, but we found this interesting that there were still many care visits occurring on time, on schedule. And then we naturally asked, were they aware of telemedicine at the neuromuscular center? And given the timing in this, while this was surprising, I guess looking back, it's not too surprising, 61% were unsure if telemedicine actually existed at their clinic. And in response to this, we put out a series of webinars around telemedicine, educating the community on how to make the most out of your telemedicine visit, what a telemedicine visit is and what it's not. Again, in reaction to the data. And that's why we felt we needed to dive into the data over time so we can react to it and create these resources. Next slide. So for access to care, we did ask, what families were most concerned about accessing during the pandemic. And here you see on your screen, high numbers for pulmonary care and cardiac, and as well as overall neuromuscular health, but worry across the board. Duchenne is a multi-system disease, lots of subspecialists. It is complicated care, involves a whole team. And there you see a quote from someone in regards to pulmonary function. Their son's lung function is declining, and they're worried about how are we going to track this with the delay of of appointments coming up. And I also think pulmonary care might have risen to the top. This is just an assumption due to the nature of COVID and its impact on pulmonary. And then there was an open box for people to add in things that were not amongst the list on the left. And once we looked at the themes of those responses, mental health, impact on mental health and access to care for mental health, as well as equipment, were two of the higher, reported things that people were worried about accessing. And those are very specific to quality of life and something we hear anecdotally across the community during the pandemic, and not just in the Duchenne community, really across all our communities. Next slide. So in terms of quality of life impacts, we did ask them, are you experiencing things like medical supply shortage, appointment for wheelchair seating, equipment delivery delays? And you had a number of people reporting at the time during the survey that they were experiencing these things. And these are things that severely impact quality of life. If you can't get a wheelchair at the time you need it, can't get the prescription to get it filled. I mean, overall, this affects not just you, your entire family. And there you see someone even mention that they believe the insurance company was using COVID to delay access to getting that wheelchair. Under family hardship, we asked about the financial impact and other sort of stresses in the family that are being caused by the pandemic, and 77% reported some sort of financial impact during the pandemic. We did have 20% report that there was no impact at the time of taking this survey. Next slide. So in an open-ended question, this is remarked before, qualitative data is lovely, but then when you have to dig into 400 responses of it, it's time consuming, but it gives you so much insight. It really, it helps describe what you're seeing in the numbers that help define things. So in this question, we just said, what else should we know about that impact on care? Once again, you see that mental health impact rising to the top. And this really ran the gamut, everything from worried about their son being depressed, anxious, caregiver burden, and depression and anxiety for the caregiver. And then you see worried about getting COVID, no surprise there. We see this in other survey data across rare disease, and the fear of going back into society, which also fits into that fear of getting COVID at the end of the day. We've been putting out educational resources around COVID about medical care. We worked with our clinical care network to put out guidelines for COVID care with the Duchenne muscular dystrophy community. So again, reacting to what we're seeing and trying to really produce some resources. I think you can go to the next slide there. For clinical trial experience, we had 81 respondents amongst the 400 report that they are participating in a clinical trial. And I think these are similar themes that you've heard before and will continue to hear about the impact of the pandemic. To the left, you did have 10%, close to 10% who were attempting to enroll, and the delays of COVID have caused that them not being able to screen, which is still the case today for many trials. But go back to the right there. For those 81 respondents, we asked, has your protocol changed? Has your usual sort of trial testing, et cetera, changed? And almost 50% said yes, and the other half said no. When we dug into what those changes were about, what did they include, most were delayed testing by the institution, whether that's safety or efficacy, which we know impacts data, or changing to telehealth. We were pleased to see on the right there that the majority did not miss a dose of their trial medication. So that was definitely a plus. But I think it remains to be seen what's going to happen with the data and how it shakes out in the end and what the FDA is going to do in terms of their flexibility. Next slide. So for FDA-approved therapies, at the time of doing this survey, we had 3, we now have 4. Here you see those who are actually taking those FDA-approved therapies. You had 46 that are not, and then the rest spread out between Emflaza, which is a steroid, and then 2 infused drugs, exon skipping drugs, Exondys and Vyondys. And we recognize these are low numbers. You certainly can't extrapolate any of this data to the entire community, but it certainly gives important insights. For the missed dose, we had a higher percentage for Exondys, Vyondys. We believe that's because these are infused therapies. Many times they require home health aides to come into the house and do the infusion. And in the qualitative data, they were concerned about that home health aide coming into the house and the safety of their family. Happy to report these folks got back on track after missing those doses. And then Emflaza, the pill, which can be mailed, we had only a very small percentage saying that they missed a dose, which was good news. So most overall hadn't missed a dose. Next slide. So with that, about 4 weeks ago, we launched a second survey. And here we wanted to reflect on what we were learning from the first survey, as well as talking to our clinical community and our other partners in the Duchenne community about what we should be diving into. This is not an apples to apples survey where we had the same questions again repeated. Some were repeated, But just because of the nature of where we are and where we've evolved, we needed to alter the survey a bit to get different insights. And this has only been in circulation for a couple of weeks. And I'm going to give you a first look at some of this data. The age breakdown there, very similar to the first survey. So next slide. So we want to understand from these families, what does your care look like since spring 2020? And here you see, you really have a mix of experiences. You have some who have been doing all in-person visits, around 27%, others that are doing a mix of in-person and telemedicine, and then those doing only telemedicine. And for those who said they did not receive care since the pandemic, they did report in qualitative sort of open-ended responses that they didn't have anything scheduled. So that is the reasoning for that percentage there. But for those who went to in-person, I wanted to know, were you required to take a COVID test prior to coming? And 20% did report yes. And then what was the biggest challenge when it came to these in-person visits? Because the high percentage of our population is pediatrics, the consistent theme there is that there was a lot of anxiety of the fact that only one parent could go into the actual care visit. They're so used to both parents coming in. I think we all would agree when you're being given information by a physician, it's always helpful to have a second person there. So I think, between the patient's anxiety and the family's anxiety, this is truly what rose to the top in terms of those in-person visits due to changes in protocol. Next slide. So we then dug into telemedicine. We wanted to understand the sort of satisfaction or dissatisfaction with the experience of telemedicine, recognizing that telemedicine can't solve everything, but we knew that more and more people were taking part in it. So on your screen here, you see the types of telemedicine visits that our community has been participating in. The highest numbers came from their neurologists, followed by pulmonologists, and so on. We did have an other option, and mostly those responses came out of things like wound care, their pediatrician, dermatologist, and even palliative care. We did want to know, because we've been hearing anecdotally about insurance, and I was actually a little surprised about this number, that 89% were not having any problems with access in terms of reimbursement by their insurance. For now, I would say, and some reported that they didn't know yet because perhaps they hadn't seen a bill or they had just recently done some of these telemedicine visits. Next slide. Okay, so, sorry, I'm drinking all this water. We then wanted them to rate satisfaction based on these actual providers. And in this first screen, you actually see the higher rated satisfaction providers that we list amongst those we asked about, where a large portion were either very satisfied or satisfied with their telemedicine visit. You had some reporting a more neutral opinion about that visit, but nobody dissatisfied or very dissatisfied. And when we looked across, I don't expect everyone to read and digest all of these responses, but I think by and large, people saw value in it, but they still really appreciate the in-person touch with their physician, given the nature of the disease, monitoring progression over time. We did see the neuropsychology comment come in that they were a lifeline during the pandemic. I don't think that's a surprise to anybody, but mental health providers certainly is an opportunity for them to do more when it comes to telemedicine. And you can do the next slide, because I know I'm probably going over time. Here's where dissatisfaction came in a little bit in the responses: pulmonologists, respiratory therapists, physical therapists, occupational therapists. And for a number of these, including physical therapy and even occupational therapy, so much of this is hands-on and is working through sort of how to make life easier in terms of occupational therapists, activities of daily living. So some of it could be done via telemedicine, but I think that hands-on approach and being together really does matter, particularly with the physical therapists. And also the trouble with physical therapists when you're monitoring a disease like Duchenne that has progressive muscle weakness over time, it's really hard to perform those outcome measures on the patient when they're not in the actual hospital setting. And we saw a number of people say that my kid was not cooperative on the Zoom meeting. So, and with the respiratory therapist, there you see a lot of neutral responses there. the responses really reflected that there's so much complexity there that they really wish to be in person. So you can go to the next slide. This is where we had the least amount of data, not many people participating in the gastro and the endo appointments. But I wanted to point out, even though we had a low end, that it's not just the actual care. People were losing connection via technology to their appointment, and they got frustrated. You know, they were dropped 2 or 3 times, and that experience does matter. And it also speaks to the fact that, you know, the need for broadband and the ability for everybody to connect. Not everybody can connect to telemedicine, and it's a reality. So we hope to have more data here that we can actually reflect on in the future. We're going to continue to collect it and report it out as time goes on. Next slide. So we heard from a lot of families the worry over testing being delayed, and testing helps you monitor what's happening with progression. It's very critical with all these subspecialists. And for those who responded to this question, you know, 50% said no testing has been delayed or not completed, but then the other half had a mix of different testing that had not been done, and lots of anxiety and worry over not knowing what's going on with their cardiac function or their pulmonary function. And you know what that means in terms of their care and what might be needed for an intervention. So these are areas we're taking and talking to our care team with. We have a certified Duchenne care network around the country of doctors who work together, and we're going to be presenting this data and talk through some of this as well. Next slide. So mental health, as you saw from the first survey, this is something that popped up, and it's popping up everywhere. This is not a novel concept that PPMD says, oh, we're going to ask about mental health. We all are doing this, but I think the question is, what do we do with the data? And I think that remains to be seen, and we're working through some of this. Here you see the spread of the question during the pandemic. Has the patient or caregiver experienced these things? You see high numbers with anxiety, either sometimes or often when it comes to the caregiver as well as the patient. So, you know, you really, that never bar is not a high percentage across the board in any of these categories. And one of the things we're looking at right now is how can we create better programs around mental health and support. We have those community sort of mentoring support programs, but we believe there's more that could be done here. Next slide. We were pleased to see for this version of the survey that access to approved therapies, less people were missing doses. So they started to get sort of the hang of, how do I need to do this in a new environment and during COVID, and how can I have the right PPE, et cetera. So next slide. I know these are a lot of slides. So just an overall assessment. Patients are still being seen in person in many cases when it comes to care. Telemedicine may work for some areas and may not work for others. I think that's true of many diseases and conditions. We were pleased to see access to approved therapies was happening, and that we were getting over the barriers there. Delayed testing causes anxiety, and then the comments around mental health, I think, persist, and I think we all would agree with that, and they can't be ignored. So